In the absolutely bitter winter of 1943, both in terms of weather and fate, the armies of Nazi Germany were thrown from the city of Stalingrad in one of the most stunning defeats of World War II. The battle lasted for months and resulted in over 1 million dead, with some estimates going as high as 3 million. The fighting was absolutely brutal, and by the end the Germans were hungry, low on ammunition, and freezing cold. True to his character, Adolf Hitler refused to let his commanding generals surrender to the Soviets, even when all hope was lost. Hitler seemed to be unable to grasp the idea that his armies would advance no further into Russia. Instead, his unfortunate generals were commanded to make a heroic and futile final stand in the name of German honor. The final stand failed, and the power of the armies deployed to Stalingrad was utterly broken. After the loss at Stalingrad, the German armies were sent streaming westward, and westward, back from the high water mark of the Third Reich. Long lines and pockets of Germans began the slow and arduous process of retreating all the way back to the German hinterlands. It did not take long for military observers and historians to comment that Hitler had failed to learn from the mistakes of his predecessors. The pathetic and broken retreat from Stalingrad looked eerily similar to Napoleon's retreat from Moscow over a century earlier. Napoleon is still mocked for his folly. One does not simply walk into Russia, especially in the winter. But what people fail to realize is that nobody sets out to invade Russia in the winter. In both Napoleon and Hitler's cases, they had grand plans to force Russia to capitulate long before the freezing temperatures set in. Napoleon had hoped to encamp his army in Moscow for the winter, where they would rest and recuperate before sallying forth in the spring to continue their campaign. Similarly, Hitler believed that his armies would also be able to winter in both Leningrad and Moscow. In both cases, they failed, but not in the way that most people think. The failure of both Napoleon and Hitler had little to do with their own military planning, but the lengths as to which the Russians would go to defend their homeland. Hitler's mistake wasn't ignoring Napoleon's folly, but rather ignoring Russian response to Napoleon's march on Moscow. Indeed, when you look at the events of 1943 and 1812, they are eerily similar. Many times people point to things in history that are only tangentially alike and claim that they are twins. But in this case, Hitler and Napoleon have much in common. They are both overambitious, they both had a military hubris that undid them, they both underestimated the Russians, and they were both sent packing in the dead of winter before ultimately losing their respective wars. Napoleon's failure in Russia was preceded by one of the largest battles in history, a victory no less. It is a battle that has largely been forgotten, along with Russia's response to their own defeat. The results changed history forever and laid the groundwork for decades of criticism to be lobbied against both Napoleon and Hitler. If you conjure up a list of the most important battles in world history, you will see a slew of familiar names. Battles like Hastings, Waterloo, Midway, Stalingrad, Cannae, and Trafalgar frequently appear. But no matter how many lists you look at, one name will not appear: Borodino. You are forgiven if you've never heard this name. The fact that the Battle of Borodino is so obscure is baffling. The battle was the turning point of Napoleon's ill-fated adventure into Russia, and arguably the turning point of the entire Napoleonic saga. It was also the single bloodiest day of the Napoleonic Wars, and it was the largest battle in history up until this point. The Battle of Borodino would not be surpassed in scale until World War I, over a century later. Yet despite those hallmarks, the battle remains frustratingly invisible in the grand scheme of history. Borodino also has the interesting distinction of being a tactical victory for the French, but an overall strategic failure. Such battles are rare. It is hard to win a battle in the field and lose the plot on the strategic map. This is especially confounding considering the man who ultimately lost the plot in 1812 was Napoleon Bonaparte. How could Napoleon win the largest battle of the century, but lose the war? People frequently point to Napoleon's failure in Russia without understanding the complexity of the moving parts happening behind the scenes. It wasn't just winter, cold weather, poor roads, and a lack of food that ultimately shredded Napoleon's Grand Army, but the events that took place in the aftermath of the Battle of Borodino. Napoleon was fighting his war on the battlefield. The Russians were fighting their war in the wheat fields. But why did Napoleon want to invade Russia in the first place? In hindsight, it is easy to look at this decision and scoff, but there was good reason for him to do so, at least in his mind at the time. What were Napoleon's goals in Russia? How did he plan on succeeding? And where did it all go wrong? Hello, welcome, and Happy New Year. This is another episode of Forgotten and Found, a history podcast by me, Grant Piper. While still in its infancy, our podcast has managed to make it into a new year, and we hope that 2025 will be a pivotal year for the podcast. As I mentioned, I find the Battle of Borodino to be a fascinating topic. It is a highly important battle that has been seemingly dumped into the dustbin of history. Not only was the battle one of the largest and most elaborate of the entire Napoleonic saga, which we will get into, but the aftermath ultimately put Napoleon on the path to his final defeat. But before we can dissect the overall outcome of Napoleon's invasion of Russia and the climactic Battle of Borodino, we first have to look at why Napoleon ventured into Russia in the first place. Looking back, it is easy to wonder why Napoleon didn't simply fortify the frontiers around his newly created puppet in the Duchy of Warsaw. Napoleon had set up the Duchy of Warsaw as a buffer state between him and the Russian Empire, and he could have been content to allow that to be the furthest reaches of his new French Empire. Unfortunately, like so much of French history before, the British were to blame. Beginning in 1806, after his decisive victory at the Battle of Austerlitz, Napoleon enacted a policy known as the Continental System. Napoleon always knew that the British were the greatest threat to his power, and he was correct in this assumption, as they would be the ones who would ultimately defeat him and oversaw his death on the island of St. Helena. In order to cut off British power in Europe, Napoleon enacted a series of blockades to prevent British ships from trading. British ships were banned from French ports and French-controlled territories. At this point in history, France controlled large portions of Europe and had a heavy influence over most of the neutral territories, which they used to try to snuff out British economic power. It was a good plan, in theory, as long as the French could get everyone to play along. It is important to remember that the Napoleonic Wars were the accumulation of 500 years of animosity between Britain and France. The two nations fought in the 100 Years' War, and then took opposite sides of the Wars of Reformation. France, just years before the events detailed here, helped the American revolutionaries throw off the shackles of British rule, which itself was the accumulation of decades of warfare over territories in the New World. The two nations hated each other, and Napoleon would not allow a chance to slight his bitter rivals pass him by. The name Continental System spoke to the idea that Europe did not need trade from island nations like Britain. The continent could be, and would be, self-sufficient. The idea was good, again, in theory. The problem was that the blockades on Britain seemed to harm parts of Europe as much or more than they did the British. Many parts of Europe had come to depend on British trade and goods, and cutting them off was a shock. Smuggling became common, and many merchants, princes, and agents attempted to quietly play both sides, make good with the French, while also trying to find ways to maintain trade with the British. So what does this have to do with Russia? Russia initially agreed to go along with the Continental System. Tsar Alexander I was eager to maintain positive ties with Napoleon. France and Russia had a long history of friendly relations, stretching from the Napoleonic Wars to World War II. However, the economic impacts to Russia were far greater than Alexander had anticipated. As blockades took effect, the Russian people were harmed. As an autocratic leader of an empire made up of large numbers of peasants, sensitive to things like the flow of cloth and grain, he could not afford to have the peasantry suffer for long periods of time. In Russia, it is always wise to heed the needs and moods of the peasantry, as future czars would learn. After 4 years of upholding Napoleon's Continental System, the Russians had had enough. In defiance of the French, Alexander I began to openly trade with the British once more in 1810. The move angered Napoleon, who saw this as an existential threat to his grand strategy of starving the British out of existence. If Russia with its vast territories was open to trade with the British, it wouldn't be long until goods managed to find their way into Russia with the purpose of being exported or imported via British ships. Russia's decision to back out of the Continental System threatened the whole. Napoleon asked Alexander I to reconsider, and when he refused to do so, he felt as though he had no other option but to invade Russia and enforce the Continental blockade by force. Napoleon had a few goals when he turned his gaze to Russia. He wanted to ensure that the continental system remained in place throughout the entire continent. He also wanted to send a message that he was the undisputed master of Europe, back out of the system and face consequences. Other great powers had some leeway in their conduct, but ultimately they had to go along with French policies and vision for Europe or risk facing the Grand Army. Lastly, he wanted to enlarge and strengthen his frontier with Russia. Russia is always a strategic threat to Eastern Europe, and France's borders needed to be protected against Russian meddling and aggression. At this point, semi-autonomous and militaristic Cossacks had a nasty habit of raiding the frontiers and the hinterlands with brutal efficiency. Much like Hitler to come, Napoleon believed that his military apparatus was infallible. The Russians had no chance of standing up to his Grand Army, and victory was assured as long as his men carried out their orders, as they always had up until this point. This hubris would ultimately precede Napoleon's fall, and with these considerations, Napoleon made plans to invade Russia and see them through. Napoleon crossed the frontier from the Duchy of Warsaw into Russia on June 24, 1812, with a host of nearly 500,000 men. The army was split into 5 columns, and they were ordered to rapidly march into Lithuania. Napoleon ordered his frontline infantry on a series of forced marches in order to advance as quickly as possible, believing that speed was the key to outmaneuvering and surprising the Russians. The problem was that this tactic immediately separated the fighting force from their supplies. The roads to the western territories of the Russian Empire were narrow dirt tracks running through empty forests and watery marshlands. These wagons were hauling gunpowder, cannons, salted meats, wine, water, bread, hardtack, replacement boots, bayonets, coats, hats, bandages, rope, hand tools, oil, and more, and they were left miles behind the front lines. Many of them became bogged down and were abandoned or broken. Numerous soaking summer rains turned the well-trodden paths into rivers of mud. Thunderstorms would bubble up during the day and often lead to hours of pounding rain that lasted late into the night. One historian said of the frequent storms, saying, quote, "The results were most disastrous for the French forces. The movement of troops was impeded or absolutely checked, and the vast troop and supply trains on the Vilnius-Kaunas road became disorganized. The existing roads became little better than quagmires, causing the horses to break down under the additional strain. The delay and the frequent loss of these supply trains caused both troops and horses to suffer. Napoleon's forces traditionally were well supplied by his transportation corps, but they proved inadequate during the invasion." In addition to poor weather and scattered supplies, typhus struck the troops. Hundreds of men came down with high fevers and painful red rashes. Soon over 50,000 men became dawdlers, stragglers, or outright deserters. The army had yet to fight a battle, and they had already lost 10% of their total number. This was uncharacteristic of a Napoleon-led army, but if this alarmed the great general, he gave no indication, and instead ordered his men to press onward with renewed haste. The French made good time, but they were running into an increasing number of issues, without encountering the Russian army at all. Napoleon's goal was to separate, trap, and destroy the Imperial Russian army, which had anywhere between 180,000 and 250,000 troops. However, so far, the army had remained out of sight, and therefore out of reach. Instead, Napoleon ran into another problem that he had not foreseen: scorched earth tactics on the part of the Russians. With each mile he pushed into Russia, he found burnt fields, torn up roads, and abandoned villages. Even the smallest peasant hamlets were seemingly stripped of flour, bread, and meat, in addition to people and animals. It took Napoleon 2 months before he was forced into a major battle during his invasion of Russia. The Battle of Smolensk took place on August 16th and pitted 45,000 French against 30,000 Russians. Smolensk was the first major fortress in Napoleon's path, and it necessitated a battle. Despite the status of the roads, the French managed to haul 200 artillery pieces to the fight, which they used to great effect. Napoleon's plans for Smolensk were simple: bombard the city with a severe cannonade before assaulting the fortress with a 3-pronged attack. The initial bombardment was far more successful and devastating than anyone had imagined. The cannon blast set the city on fire, and soon the whole settlement burned to the ground. During the battle, over 85% of the buildings were torched, and 14,000 of the 15,000 civilian inhabitants of the city died in the blaze. Seeing the city destroyed, the Russian general Barclay de Tolly ordered a small garrison to squat in the ruins and cover his retreat. Tolly blew the ammo depots, storehouses, and bridges on his way out of town, leaving the French in possession of a smoldering wasteland and little else. This would be a strong bit of foreshadowing that the French failed to see in the moment. Also concerning was the fact that Napoleon lost 10,000 men to just 6,000 on the Russian side, just 2 months into the invasion, and casualties for the French were mounting quickly. While Smolensk was technically a victory, it did nothing to alleviate the logistical problems or stem the tide of casualties and desertions that were plaguing the main army. The Tsar accepted Tolly's decision to retreat from Smolensk given the circumstances. However, in the aftermath, General Tolly was replaced with a new general named Kutuzov. Kutuzov was told that further retreats was unacceptable, and that he needed to find a suitable battleground in which the Russians could bleed and ultimately stop the French invasion. Kutuzov took his mission to heart and retreated eastward to find better ground. While Tolly and Kutuzov retreated from Smolensk, the French army continued to be harassed by Russian partisans and Cossacks. Napoleon had entered Russia with 500,000 men, with nearly 300,000 of those being fighting men. In the weeks following the battle at Smolensk, that number had dwindled to just 120,000 men fit for fighting. Disease, desertion, and starvation continued to whittle the French army away. The French began their invasion with a 3-to-1 advantage in numbers over their adversary. Now, that advantage was down to just 5-to-4. And they were at the continued disadvantage of being on enemy turf. Knowing that winter was quickly approaching, and that the Russians needed to force one final battle of the year, Kutuzov decided to array his forces around the village of Borodino. The field was not a great one for defensive maneuvers, but it blocked the 2 major roads leading into Moscow, and it was anchored by a redoubt in the center. Kutuzov doubted that his army could hold the position for long in the face of a French assault, but he was confident that he would be able to inflict an equal number of casualties on the French, which, at this point, would be enough to put their mission in jeopardy. Meanwhile, the French army continued to struggle with supply. Every hovel they entered seemed devoid of even the smallest morsels of food. Soldiers would be lucky to find a single bag of flour left behind for them to use to make hard loaves of bread. As the Russians moved eastward, further into the heartland, they torched the ground behind them to deprive it of anything useful for the French. It was under these conditions that the French pursued their prey, and in early September, the Russian army stopped their eastward retreat and turned for battle near the village of Borodino, with the hopes of stemming Napoleon's advance for good. The Battle of Borodino unfolded over the course of a single day on September 7, 1812. But with over 200,000 troops committed to the fight, it was an expansive battle. In order to cover it, we will break the battle down into 3 sectors. The first sector in the north included the titular village of Borodino, which lay on the banks of the river Moska. The second sector is situated in the center around the Revsky Redoubt. And the final sector was situated around a second village, Utisa, which sat astride a medieval road to Smolensk and anchored the south. The whole battle ran along a north-south axis, with the French arrayed in the west, or the left, and the Russians defending the east, or the right. Napoleon watched the battle from a small ridge to the rear of the field, looking eastward over his formations. The battle took place roughly 70 miles west of Moscow. Napoleon fielded 130,000 troops and 500 cannon, while the Russians fielded 120,000 troops and 600 field pieces. The battle began at 0600 sharp with a sustained barrage by the French Grand Battery, a contingent of 102 guns. The guns opened up against the Russian center, and Napoleon hoped to soften the middle third before quickly exploiting an opening. But we will have to wait to see what happens in the center, because the fighting around Revsky's Redoubt was influenced by surprising events that unfolded in the north. The northern sector was largely static during the battle. Napoleon feared that any attempt to outflank the Russian army would allow them to escape in the opposite direction of the flanking maneuver. For this reason, he arrayed his forces for a broad frontal assault and decided to ignore any elaborate movements or maneuvers. He was trusting the experience of his men and the strength of his cannons to overwhelm the hasty Russian defenses. But the North did manage to play an important role in the battle due to an oversight on the part of the French. The village of Borodino hugged the marshy banks of the Moscow River and hastily been reinforced for a defense. Napoleon decided to ignore the village in favor of attacking the redoubt in the center. He believed that the river was an insurmountable barrier that he did not want to wrangle with at this moment. However, miles to the north, a large force of Cossacks had managed to find a fordable spot in the river and cross onto the French side unopposed. When a large host of cavalry appeared near the exposed flank and in close proximity to the emperor, including the valuable supply wagons, it caused the French to have to pull 2 full regiments from the center to parry the thrust by the Cossacks. While the cavalry didn't inflict any real damage on the French, the repositioning of 2 regiments from the assault on the redoubt proved enough to rob Napoleon of a quick and easy victory in the center. The Russian generals thought this to be a failure, and they raged privately about their missed opportunity, but all was not lost. The attack on the central redoubt did not restart in earnest until 1400 hours, 8 hours after the battle had initially started. At this point, both sides were exhausted, and the French were struggling to press any sort of advantage. Revsky's redoubt was a hastily reinforced fort made up of earthworks bristling with guns and crude wooden palisades. It was no more than a speed bump on the way to Moscow, but it was here that the Russian generals had hoped to stymie the French advance. The French quickly marched straight into the teeth of the redoubt's guns, getting too close for the Russian cannons to be effective. They quickly drove off the cannon crews and forced a close-quarters battle in the shadow of the walls. The battle raged for 90 minutes, in which both sides exhausted their strength, but neither side could force a decisive outcome. Still at 15:30, the redoubt fell, and the Russian forces pulled back from their defensive positions under the booming of distant cannons. Lastly, in the south, the village of Utasa sat amidst a tangle of brambles and dusty roads. The village was defended by 23,000 Russians, but they were untrained militia, and many of them were armed with simple spears and unloaded rifles. The French could have easily forced the village and turned the lines, but they only had 10,000 soldiers, and many of them were Polish irregulars. From his hazy vantage point, Napoleon saw 23,000 Russians holding long sticks and had no idea that the militias could have been crumpled with a larger or more determined force. The wilderness around the village prevented the French from maneuvering, and despite being outgunned, the Russians were entrenched and surrounded by very poor terrain. This prevented the French from forcing the field, and the southern sector devolved into skirmishing with no real outcome. In the end, the Battle of Borodino was dangerously close to ending in a draw or a stalemate. However, the Russians decided to withdraw, giving Napoleon the field. But the battle was much closer than anyone had anticipated. Despite being beaten and banged on all day, the Russians were stubborn and gave nearly as good as they got. The battle unfolded far too slowly, and Napoleon failed to push the north or the south, and was content to allow his troops to flounder in the center for hours on end. In an era with drones and satellites, infrared lasers, topographical maps, and electronic surveillance, it is difficult to remember how challenging it was to command an army during the 19th century. None of those tools were available. Data was gathered with spyglasses, and messages were run by hand. Many times, the ground being fought on was not mapped, or even known to the people on both sides of the line. The fog of war was very real, and sometimes it was a literal fog. With 1,100 guns present during the battlefield was obscured by a persistent haze of gun smoke. Napoleon, situated a kilometer away or more from the front lines, was struggling to see exactly what was going on. Not only that, but as we will see, many of his officers had been killed or maimed in the fighting. This left the emperor in the dark as to the exact status of the battle, and this is what is attributed to his unusual hesitancy when commanding his army this particular day. Because in the end, Napoleon refused to commit his reserves to the fight, and that made all of the difference. Standing with Napoleon were 20,000 Imperial Guard troops, the very best that he had, along with dozens of crack artillerymen and 10,000 fresh regimental line infantry. In hindsight, this would have been enough to turn the tide of the battle, but Napoleon was loath to commit them and fail. If he committed his best forces and was routed, it would have left his army unable to continue the fight in Russia. So he demurred. What he didn't know was that the Russians had committed every last man, including the reserves, to the fight. The addition of 30,000 fresh French forces would have been enough to turn the tide and potentially crush the Russian army for good. Instead, the battle eked out into a marginal victory rather than the decisive victory that Napoleon desperately needed. Even without the reserves, the casualty numbers rocked the Grand Army. Napoleon lost 30,000 men dead or wounded in a single day, while the Russians lost 50,000. This made the Battle of Borodino the single bloodiest day of the Napoleonic Wars, and the bloodiest battle in Europe until World War I. But Napoleon didn't only lose valuable fighting men, he lost generals and staff officers by the dozens. A full 50 generals were killed in the battle, with many of those being killed experienced officers who had fought alongside Napoleon for over a decade. Dozens of other officers, including lieutenants, captains, and regimental commanders, also lost their lives. The Russians, whether wittingly or unwittingly, had decapitated the snake. The casualties in the officer corps were incomprehensible, and it left Napoleon devoid of valuable leadership at the dawn of his hardest season. While Napoleon claimed victory on the fields of Borodino, the strategic picture was much murkier. With his failure to commit his valuable reserve, he uncharacteristically allowed the Russian army to once again escape. Instead of pinning down the bulk of the imperial forces, he allowed the corps to melt away. This would prove fatal in the long run, but to his immediate vision, perhaps clouded with gun smoke and pride, he had cleared the way to Moscow. The road was now open, and the army began to march. Just as he had planned, Napoleon would get his army to Moscow before winter fully set in. But unbeknownst to the French, seeing Napoleon winter in Moscow was also the Russian plan. When the French army ultimately reached Moscow, they did not find a hospitable place to bed down for the winter. Instead, they found more ash. Just like they had done with the villages in the hinterland, the Russians were content to torch their capital, evacuate the civilians, and leave nothing behind. Moscow was stripped of horses, tack, meat, beer, labor, gunpowder, and even nails. Large portions of the city were burned to the ground, and the fields around the city were flattened and fallowed. The French might have captured Moscow, but there was nothing to show for it. Still, Napoleon sent a strongly worded message to the Tsar, who had retreated to his palace in St. Petersburg. He said he was now in possession of the Russian capital and had routed the Tsar's army. Therefore, he demanded the immediate surrender of the Russian Empire. But his message went unheeded. Napoleon waited days and then weeks before he realized that a reply simply wasn't coming. The Tsar was ignoring him, and he was doing so on purpose. In the meantime, the French army squatted in the ruins of Moscow as the temperatures continued to fall, and the days continued to grow shorter. By the time Napoleon realized what was happening, it was all too late. The Russian army had scattered to the southeast, the Tsar had fled to the northwest, and the French were left with nothing, and they were out of food. So Napoleon had to do the unthinkable and retreat from Russia during an oncoming winter, and the results were horrendous. The Russian army reappeared just in time to harass the retreating French as Cossacks swept in and raided what few baggage trains were left. In the end, Napoleon barely made it out of Russia alive. Out of the 500,000 men who entered Russia, only 120,000 would make it back. 380,000 French died, with many of them freezing, starving, or falling to disease. Thousands died or deserted on the roads out of Russia as they dashed for freedom of the French border. By the time they returned to Central Europe, Napoleon's Grand Army had been gutted, and it would never return to the heights that it once enjoyed. That was all preceded by the Battle of Borodino and the events immediately following. The Battle of Borodino was one of the most important battles of the Napoleonic Wars, and yet it does not get the credit that it deserves, in the same way that battles like Waterloo and Austerlitz do. In many ways, this battle was a foretaste of the warfare that was to come to the European continent in future generations. The massive number of troops, the reluctance to maneuver through tangled ground, the reliance on cannons, and the slowness of moving through hastily constructed defenses would all appear again in the Crimean War and then later in World War I. After Borodino, Napoleon's armies were never the same. They limped out of Russia, humiliated, tired, and greatly reduced in strength. And while Napoleon frantically attempted to rebuild his Grand Army, it never again would resemble the military juggernaut that had terrorized the continent over the previous decade. Napoleon's armies would not be able to rest and recuperate fully until early 1813, and at this point it was just a year and a half later when Napoleon was finally pinned down and defeated by his nemesis, the British Duke of Wellington, at the Battle of Waterloo. It is impossible to say for sure how history would have turned out if Napoleon had never invaded Russia. What we do know is that the invasion of Russia was ill-fated and ill-conceived from the start. Napoleon had vastly underestimated his Russian opponents and had also underestimated the brutality of the wilderness that inhabited the Western Russian Empire. While Napoleon won a string of battles within Russia, he ultimately lost the war, unable to keep large numbers of men well supplied in the field. The Battle of Borodino was the turning point of the entire campaign, and while the French managed to drive the Russians from the field, the casualties and the poor strategic position left them with few options in the aftermath. The casualties from the Battle of Borodino, along with the willingness of the Russians to completely destroy their own capital just to spite the French, left Napoleon with few options. And when the Russian Tsar refused to surrender, it forced Napoleon out of Russia. The rest, as we say, is history. Napoleon's invasion of Russia gravely wounded his Grand Army and left them vulnerable to attacks by the British, who had spent the time that Napoleon was in Russia rebuilding their own armies in the hopes of one grand final campaign to end Napoleon's reign of terror for good. And they would do so in 1815. Learning from their disastrous mistakes with the banishment of Napoleon to the island of Elba, the British this time took no chances, and when they captured Napoleon after the Battle of Waterloo, they sent him to the remote volcanic island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. It was here that Napoleon would spend his final days, moaning about his treatment and complaining about the British. Napoleon would only live a few years in harsh conditions before succumbing to disease. The British ultimately won, and all of that was predicated on the Battle of Borodino and the March on Moscow. Thank you for listening to another episode of Forgotten and Found. We will be back next week with another unique and obscure topic from the annals of history. If you want to support me, please check out my Patreon. Additionally, if you want to read more great topics about everything from history to religion to technology, please check out my work at grantpiperwriting.medium.com. Until next time, I've been your host, Grant Piper. Be good and God bless.